The series begins with Lady Jane in the garden with her maid, Susanna. We learn that Jane is obsessed with herbal medicine and wants to write and sell a book about it. Then she quickly returns to her mansion because Duke Leicester is visiting them today. He is Jane's uncle who inherited everything because Jane's father did not have a male heir to inherit him. This makes Frances, Jane's mother, and her daughters under Leicester's care. They obey him and treat him well to continue living in their mansion as they are and to have money for living. During lunch, Leicester tells Jane that he has decided she should get married. Jane is shocked at that moment and loses control of her emotions. Her mother tries to calm things down, telling Leicester that Jane is surprised and happy about the news, just unable to express her joy correctly. Frances takes Jane to her room, scolds her, tells her she will marry Lord Guilford Dudley instead of being obsessed with her herbal book and talking all the time with her maid, Susanna. Jane is even more shocked because Guilford has a bad reputation. Everyone says he drinks a lot, gets into fights and problems, and spends every night in brothels. Jane tells her mother that even if Guilford were the last person on earth, she would never agree to marry him. Her mother tells her that her marriage will protect them and their social status because she is not ready to live in a hut due to her refusal of such an important suitor. She reminds her of the immense wealth that Guildford and his family possess, but Jane remains adamant in her refusal and warns her mother that she might run away to avoid marriage. When Frances tries to slap Jane, she stops her, telling her she does not need her approval. She shocks her by revealing that she burned her herbal book, deeply upsetting Jane. At dawn, Jane talks to Susanna and tells her that she has decided to flee north, stealing her mother's ring to sell it. Susanna tries to dissuade her, warning her of the civil wars happening everywhere, but Jane remains determined because she will not let her mother sell her into marriage. Susanna reluctantly agrees to run away with her because she does not want to leave her alone. As they are escaping, they suddenly hear dogs chasing them. They are terrified and try to run, but unfortunately they are caught by Frances and her guard. Frances accuses Susanna of stealing her ring. Jane speaks up, denying it and admitting she stole the ring, but her mother does not believe her and insists on punishing Susanna for escaping with Jane. Suddenly, Susanna transforms into a bird and flies away, shocking Jane as she realizes Susanna is an ethereal being. Frances accuses Jane of knowing this and hiding her in the mansion. Jane insists she did not know. After that, Jane sits down to read about the Atheists, and we learn that they are a species of humans who can transform into animals. Those who are like Jane and do not transform into anything are called the Pure Ones. All the Pure Ones believe that the Atheists were sent by the devil to destroy humanity. However, being atheists is not a choice, as a person is born that way and discovers it during puberty. We also learn that they suffer from great persecution. During the reign of King Henry, he decided to banish them to the wilderness, where they resorted to stealing and begging to survive. Later at the mansion, Jane discovers that her mother is traveling to London to start preparing for her marriage, so Jane decides to follow her. When Dudley welcomes Frances, both are surprised that Jane came too. Then Jane asks Dudley about his son, Guildford, and he informs her that he is not at the mansion at the moment. At that point, Jane mocks Guildford, saying he must either be at the bar drinking or in a fight because she knows everything about him from people's talk. Her mother gets annoyed with her but ignores Jane's comments and talks about his other son, Stan, informing them that he is engaged to a wealthy princess like them. Jane interrupts him, stating she does not want to marry his son. Dudley responds by saying that no one is waiting to hear her opinion, shocking Jane with his reply. Afterwards, she leaves the mansion and sees Stan harshly treating some beggar children. She argues with him about his behavior and notices his arrogance and pride. She then learns from one of the children that he is one of Dudley's sons and mistakenly thinks he is Guildford. She then decides to visit King Edward, who is very happy to see her because they are relatives. Jane talks to Edward about her mother wanting to force her into marriage, but he surprises her by saying he knows about her marriage to Guildford and approves of it because she must sacrifice to save her family. Jane is shocked by Edward as well, but he explains to her that everyone is born with their fate, just as his fate made him king, which he does not enjoy, especially since he is in his final days. Jane is puzzled by his words and asks him what he means. He reveals to her that he is sick with tuberculosis and is dying. He reassures her that Guildford is not as bad as she thinks and that she will be able to change him with her cleverness. Then Mary and Bess come to Edward, and we learn they are his sisters. Mary has prepared Edward favorite blueberry cake. Suddenly, Edward feels like he cannot breathe due to his illness. Jane asks Bess to pick a violet flower from the garden to place in Edward's mouth as it helps with breathing. This indeed helps Edward to breathe normally again. After that, Seymour, Edward's advisor, decides to have Jane take a carriage back to her mansion because he does not want her near Edward. When he goes to Edward, he hands him a paper to sign because they need an heir to the throne after his death. Seymour suggests that it should be his sister, Mary, since she is the eldest. But at that moment, Dudley objects, saying that Mary is not a legitimate sister to Edward due to rumors that her mother had an affair with her husband, King Arthur, Edward's father. This makes Bess the most suitable candidate to rule the country after Edward. However, Seymour disagrees, stating that Bess's mother was an Ethian and the people would not accept such a thing. At that point, Dudley cunningly suggests that Jane should take the throne after Edward, since she is his relative and of the same lineage. Seymour then understands that this is Dudley's plan, and that is why he had his son, Guildford, propose to Jane. Edward responds to them, saying that he has prepared his will and has chosen who will be king after him, and that the will shall not be opened until after his death. Meanwhile, the carriage that Jane is riding breaks down. The driver tries to fix it. At that moment, Jane takes a horse and escapes. When she sees the soldiers chasing her, she enters a nearby tavern to hide. There she notices a young man who stands out because of his way of talking and joking. It becomes apparent that she is attracted to him, so she decides to approach him to get to know him. However, he treats her arrogantly, prompting Jane to act arrogantly in return. At the same time, two men enter the tavern, and the tavern owner immediately asks them to leave to avoid trouble as usual. Soldiers enter the tavern looking for a man named Archer. We discover that Archer is one of the two men who entered the tavern earlier. Archer stands before the soldiers and transforms into a large bear, to the astonishment and fear of everyone present. We learn that he is one of the atheists and can transform into a bear. He attacks the soldiers and fights them. Jane is shocked by what she sees, as it is the first time she has seen a human transform into a bear. Suddenly, she notices a bird in the tavern, realizes it is Susanna. She calls out to her to talk, but the young man with her asks her to stay with him. It is clear at that moment that he is also attracted to Jane. However, Jane decides to leave him and follow Susanna. Suddenly, the soldiers attack Jane and Susanna, but Susanna manages to escape. At that moment, the soldiers capture Jane. They decide to drown her in the well to ensure she is not an Ethian. At that moment, Frances arrives in a carriage and yells at the soldiers to release her daughter, informing them that she is Lady Jane, a relative of King Edward. The soldiers then release Jane. Afterward, in the carriage, Jane begs her mother not to make her marry Lord Guildford. Her mother informs her that if she does not marry Guildford tomorrow, she will make her sister, Catherine, marry Duke Leicester. Jane is shocked at that moment. At the mansion, Edward is sitting in his room when suddenly he finds his dog has turned into a human. He discovers that his dog is one of the atheists, and her name is Petunia. He is very frightened and calls for his guards. Petunia silences him and shows him the necklace she is wearing. He is shocked because it is the necklace his grandmother was buried with. Petunia tells him that his grandmother is still alive and sent her to the mansion because she suspects he is not sick with tuberculosis, as everyone says. This turns out to be true because she discovered during her time in the mansion that the food he receives is poisoned, destroying his health and killing him slowly. She asks him to leave with her to protect him, but Edward refuses to leave the mansion without knowing who is poisoning him, so he can kill and punish the culprit himself. At the same time, we discover that Mary, Edward's sister, is in a relationship with Seymour, and they are plotting together for Mary to become queen after Edward. The next morning, Jane is sitting, thinking about the young man she saw in the tavern, and how the chance to meet a handsome young man and live the adventures of love with someone will never happen because of her marriage. She then puts on her wedding dress and is ready for the wedding. Edward takes her to hand her over personally to Lord Guildford. Jane is shocked when she finds out he is the same young man she met in the tavern, and he is equally shocked that the girl he met in the tavern is his bride, Jane. Suddenly, Jane coughs, and blood comes from her mouth, pretending to faint. Guildford understands Jane's tricks. We learn then that she put fake blood in her mouth to make Guildford scared and refuse to marry her. At that moment, Bates, the king's doctor who is among the attendees, discovers that she was pretending and faking her illness. Jane returns to the wedding and agrees in front of the priest to marry Guildford. Later, Frances talks to Jane privately to give her some advice that serves her personal interest. At the same time, Dudley is also talking to Guildford about the same thing. He then stands and addresses all the guests to congratulate the newlyweds on their happy marriage. Afterward, Bess, Edward's sister, speaks, expressing her great displeasure with the guests who are talking about her brother's imminent death. She tells them that such talk is treason and reassures them that King Edward is alive and well. In reality, Edward has returned to the palace because he is very ill. At that moment, Mary and Seymour are with him to care for him. Mary asks Seymour if they have captured Archer, yet because she wants to get rid of him as he is the leader of the atheists. Seymour informs her that they are still trying to catch him. When Mary and Seymour leave, Petunia returns to her human form, having hidden food for Edward under the bed to prevent him from eating anything from the palace. She tells him she will try to find out who is poisoning his food. At the wedding, everyone asks Guildford to kiss Jane now that she is his wife. Guildford agrees but tricks Jane and does not kiss her, which greatly upsets her. At that moment, she sees a thief in the area attempting to steal their wedding gifts. She suddenly sees him transform into a cat and realizes he is one of the atheists named Fitz. She follows him to ask about Susanna, knowing she is an Atheian like him. He tells her that not all atheists know each other and quickly runs away because Guildford is approaching. Guildford then tells Jane that he wants to apologize for what he did to her earlier. Jane responds that it does not matter because she plans to leave him at the earliest opportunity. Guildford is surprised and asks why. She tells him that his reputation is bad. Everyone talks about his poor morals. At that moment, he becomes curious about why she married him despite his bad reputation. She tells him she was forced to, intending to upset him as much as he upsets her. He then reveals that he was also forced to marry her to annoy her. At that moment, Dudley and Catherine enter to take them and prepare them for the next stage, which is a shock for Jane. It turns out that their first night together must be witnessed by all the wedding guests, who stay with them in their room for a while before leaving them alone. We discover that Jane and Guildford were pretending to be a loving couple in front of everyone, but in reality, Guildford cannot bring himself to be close to Jane, while Jane is willing to be close to him because she likes him despite not showing her feelings. She gets upset and angry due to Guildford's strange behavior towards her, so she decides to throw a glass of water at him. She then opens the wardrobe door, thinking it is the balcony door, and gets locked inside. She asks Guildford to let her out, but he ignores her. It passes a long time, and Jane is trapped in the wardrobe until a maid enters the room to clean. She hears Jane's voice coming from the wardrobe. The maid helps her out and assists her. At that moment, Jane doesn't find Guildford in the room. She learns from the maid that he's in the stable. She goes down there to confront him, upset that he left her alone, trapped in the wardrobe. He coldly replies, blaming her for what happened. Suddenly, as soon as Guildford sees daylight, he becomes very tense. He asks Jane to leave immediately, but Jane refuses. Suddenly, she is shocked to find Guildford transforming into a horse. She speaks to him while worried about his well-being, urging him to return to his human form quickly so that a servant doesn't learn his secret. However, Guildford doesn't respond to her, and at that moment, Dudley enters. He explains to Jane Guildford's rare condition that he can't control his ethereal powers. Jane is very surprised to learn that the ethereals can transform at any time they want. Dudley informs her that Guildford's condition is incomprehensible because he lives with horses all day and at night he lives in his human form. He reassures her that with time she will get used to Guildford's condition, will stop being shocked. He introduces her to Robert, who takes care of Guildford when he turns into a horse and tells her that they will go on a honeymoon with them. Jane asks him how they will go on a honeymoon with a horse, and then Dudley notices that Jane could cause a problem. He warns her that if anyone knows that there has been a marriage between a pure and an ethereal, the whole family will be executed. Jane is scared at that moment. Then Edward pretends to go to the market and has Petunia with him. They are looking for someone who sells medicinal herbs in the market. Find a young girl selling all kinds of medicinal herbs. Edward asks her if she sells the poison that kills slowly. She gets nervous and scared and argues with Petunia, takes advantage of her distraction to search among the herbs. At that time, she finds a herb called Tofana. This is the herb used as a poison. The girl is shocked and tries to take the box from Edward. At that moment, Petunia attacks her, threatening her that she will kill her if she doesn't confess and tell who comes to take the Tofana from her. Afterwards, in the palace, Jane thinks about how to escape from the trouble she has put herself in. She sees the wedding gift box and the servants arranging it. She decides to sell what's inside to escape far away. However, the maid informs her that the box has been prepared for her honeymoon with Guildford. She and Guildford will leave for the honeymoon. At that moment, Stan, Guildford's brother, comes to give Jane the gift that Edward sent her. Jane finds the gift is a dagger. As soon as Stan leaves, Jane opens the dagger and finds a secret message from Edward. In the letter, he asks her to meet him at their secret place. Jane goes to meet him and asks about the Tofana, since she is an expert in herbs. Edward lies, telling her that he has a friend who took some and is now very ill. She informs him that it is a catastrophic herb, and anyone who ingests it will have their health completely destroyed because it is a lethal poison. Edward is shocked at that moment, but Jane reassures him that she will stay with him and help his friend. Edward refuses and asks her to return to her husband. This upsets Jane, and she argues with him, saying that he no longer keeps her secrets as he used to despite their strong friendship and closeness. She leaves angrily. After that, Edward returns to the palace and gathers all his advisors, soldiers, and guards. He informs them that he has discovered he is not sick and that someone in the palace is trying to poison him. Seymour and Dudley are shocked and very nervous as they speak, promising Edward that they will find the culprit and bring him to him. Seymour goes to Mary to inform her that Edward has discovered that someone in the palace is poisoning him. Mary is shocked and nervous, telling him that she will handle the matter herself. At the same time, Dudley goes to his son Stan and asks him to go to the office and fetch Edward's will because conspirators are trying to harm him. Stan goes to Frances and shocks her by saying that Edward's will is missing because he just returned from the office as she asked. This means the will has been stolen. Meanwhile, in the palace, Seymour goes to Edward with Dudley, Mary, and Bess. He tells Edward that he has found the traitor who is poisoning him and accuses Dudley of using Tofana poison. Dudley is shocked and defends himself, but Edward orders his guards to imprison Dudley in the tower. At that moment, Mary asks Bess to take the dog out of the room because its barking is loud and annoying. Bess complies with her sister's request. Mary approaches Edward, pretending to help him, but he sees a necklace with a ring and an eye symbol around her neck. He realizes that his sister Mary is the one poisoning him. Mary then sprays something on Edward that makes him lose consciousness. At night, Jane arrives at the place where she will stay during her honeymoon. Guildford has returned to his human form. Jane asks him about the wedding gift box that he replaced with books. He informs her that all the books are about how to cure the atheists because he overheard his father saying that she is intelligent, loves herbs, and makes different treatments from them. He hopes she might be able to help and cure him of his condition. He promises her that if she cures him, he will divorce her and set her free. They agree to be friends, and each has a separate room to sleep in, despite Jane feeling a strong attraction to Guildford. At the same moment, Edward regains consciousness and finds himself locked in a room in the tower. He places a chair against the door to prevent anyone from entering, opens the window, jumps out. Mary and Seymour push the door open with force and discover that Edward has jumped out of the window. They are very happy. Pink fell into the lake and drowned. Jane stays up all night reading all the books to find a solution and a cure for Guildford's condition. He enters and is surprised to see her still awake. They then go together to the stable so Jane can try a Latin spell on Guildford intended to expel the ethereal demon from his body. Unfortunately, the spell does not work, and as soon as daylight breaks, Guildford transforms into a horse. Jane finds a letter from Susanna at the door of the house where she and Guildford are staying. She goes to the maid, Bertie, to ask for money from Guildford's belongings because she needs to help her friend. The maid informs her that she can't give her anything without Guildford's permission. Meanwhile, at the palace, Bess goes to check on her brother Edward, but the guards prevent her from entering, saying he is ill and needs rest. She then goes to Mary and is surprised to find Seymour in her room. Seymour asks her to leave because Mary is not available to meet her. Mary tells Seymour she feels Bess is suspicious and might investigate and discover their plan. Seymour reassures her, saying that this is just Bess's usual way. Mary asks when they will announce Edward's death. She can't wait any longer. Seymour tells her that it is too early to announce something like that because they need to inform the King's Council and find Edward's body. Mary gets angry, saying that the current has likely carried Edward's body away and that everyone already knows that Dudley poisoned Edward. Therefore, they should announce his death and read the will. Seymour learns from the guards, Phillips and Hodgkins, that the will is missing from the office. He instructs them to find Jane and Guildford and kill them, making it look like an accident. At night, Guildford returns to his human form and sits down for dinner with Jane. She shows him Susanna's letter, which is a ransom demand. Guildford tells her that he can't help because his family is bankrupt and has no money. Jane is shocked because she married him thinking he was wealthy, meaning her mother was deceived by his father. Jane decides to take all the silver in the house and go to Susanna alone. As she walks through the forest, she hears someone behind her. She picks up a rock to protect herself, but discovers it is Guildford. He tells her it is too dangerous to walk alone in the forest and insists on going with her, saying he wouldn't know what to tell people if something happened to her. He gives her the knife he brought to protect herself, but he's surprised to see that Jane already has a sharp dagger. At the same time, the guards, Phillips and Hodgkins, go to the house where Guildford and Jane are staying and ask the maid, Bertie, about them. She tells them they are busy at the moment, but they threaten her with weapons, forcing her to call them. Frightened, she tells them that they went for a moonlit walk like any newlyweds. In the forest, Jane and Guildford compete in a duel. Jane easily and skillfully overpowers Guildford. She asks him about the first time he transformed into a horse, but he gets upset and refuses to answer. He then asks her why she is risking herself for her maid. She explains that after her father's death, everyone was in shock and she was in a difficult mental state. No one cared to talk to her or console her except Susanna. Since then, they have been very close friends. Suddenly, Jane and Guildford see Susanna free with the other atheists. Susanna talks about how Jane will come to save her because of her message. Jane is shocked and realizes that Susanna was deceiving her. She goes to her, upset, confronts her. Susanna explains that she didn't deceive or lie to her, that the atheists really won't survive until the next winter, especially with the royal guards everywhere torturing and burning them. Guildford responds, telling Susanna that everyone knows their truth and that the gang is among the most dangerous atheists' criminals. Jane asks Guildford to leave her alone with Susanna and then asks Susanna if she really is a member of the gang. Susanna tells her that her family used to beat her violently when she was little. It was the gang that saved her. They helped her get a job as a maid for Jane's family. She lived in peace and safety till Jane asked her to run away with her. Suddenly, Guildford calls for Jane. They see the guards, Phillips and Hodgkins, killing one of the atheists. The guards notice them, start chasing them. Susanna escapes in one direction, Jane and Guildford in another. When the guards catch Jane and Guildford, tell them they have orders to kill them. Guildford fights the guards and tells Jane to run away, but Jane hits Phillips on the head with a rock, takes his sword, and fights Hodgkins. Hodgkins is shocked by Jane's dueling skills, and he and Phillips flee in fear. After this, the attraction and admiration between Jane and Guildford grow, and they enter into a relationship. However, Jane remembers she wants a divorce and distances herself from Guildford. Later, Guildford sits with Jane and decides to tell her about the first time he transformed into a horse, which happened on the day his mother was killed. Jane is deeply moved by his story. Meanwhile, in the palace, Mary sits on Edward's throne and begins to announce her decisions to everyone. At that moment, Lord Wex speaks up, informing her that Edward is not dead yet. It is only a matter of time before he recovers and returns to health. Until that moment, no one can take his place, regardless of who they are. Mary decides to give Wex one of her family's estates to silence him. Wex is delighted with the estate, falls silent. After everyone leaves, Bess asks Mary to let her see Edward. Mary is forced to tell her that Edward threw himself out of the window and died. Bess is shocked by the news. Frances then decides to marry her daughter Catherine to Duke Leicester for his money, not caring that he is very old and that Catherine will live a miserable and sad life. The next morning, Margaret, Catherine's younger sister, decides to suffocate Leicester to death to save Catherine from living with him. Frances arrives and sees Leicester dead on the floor, with Catherine and Margaret standing next to him. She does not care about what happened and takes her daughters to prepare for what's next. We then learn that Edward's will is with Bess, who stole it from the office. Petunia, in her dog form, attacks Bess and takes the will, running off with it. Petunia gives it to a guard named Charles, who opens it in front of everyone and is shocked by what is written. Royal messenger then goes to Jane with a message from the palace, informing her that King Edward has died and she has been named his heir. Jane is shocked by the news. Jane then heads to the palace with Guildford. Seymour meets her with the crown and hands it to her to wear. When she enters the palace, she is very nervous and anxious. Her younger sister calls her the Queen, but Jane asks her to call her by her regular name, saying nothing has changed. However, her mother intervenes. Refusing to let them call her by her name, she and Catherine and Margaret bow to her. Jane is so shocked that she faints. Afterward, Mary argues with Seymour, accusing him of assuring her that the will was with him and everything was in order. She cannot believe that someone like Jane could become the Queen of England. Mary decides to plot Jane's murder to get rid of her, and angrily demands Seymour give her the key to his secret prison. Jane regains consciousness and is startled by the number of guards around her. She feels suffocated and unable to breathe. Charles asks the guards to leave, staying with Jane. She asks him what happened to Edward. He tells her that Edward died in the northern tower of the palace after throwing himself out of the window upon discovering that Dudley was poisoning him. However, Charles tells Jane that he suspects Edward didn't commit suicide and that someone is behind everything that happened. Jane then goes to the room where Edward was in the tower. Guildford enters and she tells him that the person who tried to kill them is the same one who killed Edward. Guildford tries to calm and reassure her. When he approaches her, Jane pushes him away again despite her admiration and love for him. The next morning, Jane wakes up startled by her mother's voice, who wakes her up because she has a lot of work to do now that she is queen. Her mother forces her to wear a grand puffy dress and gives her instructions on what to say and how to behave with everyone. Jane sits on the throne, facing Dudley, who swears he is innocent and would never think of killing King Edward. Jane asks how Tofana poison ended up in his pocket. Seymour tells her that the cook testified that Dudley was putting poison in Edward's food. Seymour and Dudley start arguing and fighting with each other. Jane then interrogates the cook and notices she is lying and saying strange, illogical things, claiming that the Tofana poison was in a golden pot, not a small box. Jane becomes certain that someone forced her to give false testimony. She warns the cook that the penalty for perjury is having her eyes gouged out with a spoon. The cook gets scared, transforms into a cat, and tries to escape. Guards are shocked that she is an Ethian and kill her. Bess finds Mary in her room with the dog, holding a dagger to its neck, threatening to kill it. Bess is shocked and begs her to let the dog go. Mary tells her that she and Seymour know she stole the will and forces her to take a box and place it next to Jane at night. Otherwise, she will kill both Bess and the dog. Bess reluctantly agrees and takes the box to Jane, placing it among the books, claiming she brought them for Jane to read and entertain herself. Jane asks Bess to stay and talk for a while. During this time, Bess sees a terrifying black snake emerging from the box. Frightened, she decides to cover the box with the books again, takes it with her as she leaves. Dudley is sitting with Guildford after Jane issued an order for his release. As there was no evidence proving he killed Edward, Dudley asks Guildford to talk to Jane and requests that she appoint him as king. Guildford is surprised by this request. Dudley explains that if he becomes king, he will have the power to protect himself and find the cure he needs. Guildford becomes angry, accusing his father of planning his marriage to Jane because he knew she would become queen and wanted to exploit her. Dudley tells him that he is willing to do everything in his power to restore their family's reputation and protect him and his secret. He asks Guildford not to stand in the way of achieving greatness. The next morning, Bess is in the garden trying to get rid of the snake and keep it away from the palace. Suddenly, the snake transforms into a human, revealing he is an Ethian. Bess is even more shocked when the dog with her also transforms and introduces herself as Petunia. Petunia apologizes for not being able to protect Edward from Mary's evil. Bess asks her to tell her everything. At the same time, Jane wakes up startled by nightmares and decides to enter Seymour's room. When he finds her searching his belongings, she asks him for the list of palace guards. Seymour takes the list out of his safe, but deliberately drops the papers into the fireplace, burning them. Jane is then convinced that Seymour is hiding something. Mary goes to Bess, angry that Jane is still alive. The snake did not bite her. Bess lies, telling her that the snake was dead in the box. Mary decides to come up with a new plan and asks Seymour to get her some Tofana poison. At night, Catherine and Margaret sneak into Seymour's room to open the safe, retrieve its contents for Jane. They cannot find the key. Margaret tries to open the safe with a hairpin. Meanwhile, everyone is at the dinner Jane prepared. Mary secretly puts Tofana poison in Jane's drink. In his excitement, Stan grabs Jane's drink, but Francis takes it from him before he can drink it. Seymour is forced to break the glass to prevent anyone else from drinking it. At that moment, Margaret and Catherine signal to Jane, showing her the notebook they found in Seymour's safe. Jane and Guildford look inside the notebook and find many encrypted messages. Guildford takes out his cipher wheel, which will help them decode the messages. They stay up all night together, deciphering the messages to find out what is written. They discover that Seymour and Mary are in a relationship. Suddenly, they find messages about the Tofana poison and Edward. Jane is shocked to learn that Mary planned to kill her brother. She leaves Guildford in the stable and walks away. At the same time, she encounters Mary on her way to the stable. Jane fears Mary will discover Guildford's secret and decides to confront her with the messages, accusing her of killing Edward. Mary attacks Jane, hitting and strangling her, managing to take the messages from her. She puts them in her mouth and swallows them, making Jane lose consciousness. Mary thinks she has killed Jane and gotten rid of her. Meanwhile, Francis is spying on Guildford and sees him transform into a horse, discovering his secret. Edward, however, is still alive. He is with his grandmother, Margaret, who has become a saint and is living in a church. She is caring for and treating Edward. Edward learns from his grandmother that she has the antidote to the poison in his blood. She introduces him to the girl who rescued him from the tower when he jumped, as she is an Ethian who can transform into a bird. Jane regains consciousness, finds herself in the garden. She runs to the stable to check on Guildford. Robert assures her that he is fine. However, Jane cannot find the remaining messages in the place she and Guildford hid them. Robert tells her that Mary came and took everything. Jane then meets with Dudley and tells him that Mary killed Edward, tried to kill her too. Dudley warns her not to speak out now because Seymour will claim she spent the night with him and will make her appear insane to remove her from power. He advises her to appoint Guildford as king quickly and has all the necessary papers ready for Jane to sign. Jane believes they need to devise a thorough plan to counter Mary's schemes. At that moment, Charles enters, telling Jane that a girl wants to meet her and gave him a feather to give to her. Jane realizes it is Susanna and goes to meet her, overjoyed. However, Susanna greets her with anger, asking if Jane ordered her guards to attack their camps. Jane is shocked and denies doing such a thing, tending to Susanna's wounds on her face and assuring her that she won't let it happen again. Jane then goes to the royal guards and informs them that she will replace them all, warning that anyone who disobeys her orders will be hanged. Seymour is shocked at this announcement. At that time, Mary is with a man named Norfolk, who we learn was a friend of her father. She asks him to help her because she wants to kill Jane and needs 10,000 soldiers for a war. He agrees, but with one condition. Mary must appoint him as her chief advisor instead of Seymour. Mary agrees. Later, Jane appears in front of Mary, who isn't afraid of her. When Seymour informs Mary that Jane has replaced all the royal guards, Mary loses her mind and accuses Jane of letting the savage atheists kill them. Jane responds by saying that the atheists are not savages. At that moment, Mary loses her temper, but Seymour takes her away. Jane realizes that hatred is Mary's weakness, which she can use to fight her. Jane sends a message with Susanna to Archer before she leaves, asking her to deliver it personally. At that moment, Francis arrives, causing Susanna to flee. Francis speaks with Jane about Guildford, revealing that she knows he is an Eth. Jane is shocked, especially since her mother insists on her divorcing Guildford. Jane angrily refuses, reminding her mother that she is the queen and no one can decide anything for her anymore. Jane then leaves. Jane goes to Guildford and tells him that she doesn't want to divorce him. Guildford is visibly happy because he has also fallen in love with Jane and doesn't want to leave her. The next morning, Edward is surprised by someone in the room who introduces himself as Fitz. Fitz tells Edward that he needs to escape with him because he is in danger now. Edward doesn't believe him, thinking he is safe with his grandmother. Fitz explains that he is there to help and protect Edward, then transforms into a cat and leaves through the window. Edward's grandmother enters, revealing that she is an Ethian and transforms into a turtle. She tells Edward that he is also an Ethian, but hasn't learned to use his transformation ability yet. Edward is amazed by her revelation. Meanwhile, Petunia convinces Bess to go with her to stay with her grandmother. Bess decides to leave a message for Jane before she leaves, but unfortunately, Seymour finds the message. He confronts Bess with it and decides to kidnap her to ensure she doesn't speak to anyone else. At night, Guildford presents Jane with his mother's earrings as a gift. Jane is very happy and appreciates his gesture. Jane and Guildford then go to the party they have organized, where everyone is present. Jane surprises them by announcing that she has invited the atheists to the party to end the racism created by their ancestors, insisting that atheists are neither monsters nor harmful. As the atheists enter the party, everyone is astonished and disapproving. Mary speaks to Jane maliciously, trying to turn everyone against her rule, but Jane smartly makes Mary lose her temper, causing her to leave in embarrassment. Jane thanks Archer for accepting her invitation to the party and promises him that she will change everything. Jane decides to talk to Guildford alone, telling him that she couldn't find a cure for his condition because there is no cure for the atheists. Their transformation is natural, something he must accept. Guildford becomes angry and upset with Jane, believing she didn't care enough to find a cure as she had promised. He leaves, feeling followed, and discovers it's one of the atheists, who tells him he overheard the conversation with Jane and knows where the cure is and can help him. The next morning, Petunia introduces herself to Jane and tells her that she can bring the girl who sold Tofana to Seymour and Mary. The girl arrives at the palace and confesses that Seymour and Mary bought Tofana from her. Jane orders the guards to arrest them, but is shocked to learn they have escaped. Jane gathers everyone to inform them that Mary and Seymour fled because they betrayed King Edward. Suddenly, someone attacks Jane with an arrow, attempting to kill her. It is revealed that Mary sent the attacker, but Archer manages to save and protect Jane. Dudley informs Jane that all the royal court left with their servants because of her declaration of solidarity and sympathy with the atheists. That night, Jane goes to the stable to see Guildford and talk to him. However, Robert tells her that Guildford left to find the cure himself. Jane is shocked and cries out of distress. She goes to Dudley to ask if he knew Guildford was leaving, tells her that Guildford felt she wasn't by his side and didn't understand his suffering. Meanwhile, Edward tries to escape and is confronted by Fitz, who tells him that he was right about being in danger because his grandmother is clearly insane. Fitz offers to help Edward but demands payment. Edward agrees and they move together, but they find the exit door locked. Fitz, in his cat form, goes to fetch the key. Suddenly, Edward sees one of his grandmother's aides capturing Fitz and putting him in a bag. Edward engages in a fierce struggle with the aide. Fitz manages to free himself, strikes the aide on the head. They continue their escape together. The next day at the palace, Jane is very sad because of Guildford's absence. Her mood worsens with the sudden rain, which cancels all the games she had planned for the remaining court members to keep them entertained and prevent them from leaving until Mary reappears to fight her with their help. However, Jane refuses to give up and decides to set up a bowling game inside the palace, trying to win everyone over and get them to participate. Meanwhile, Norfolk decides to compete against Archer with a condition. If Norfolk wins, the atheists will return to the wilderness, but if Archer wins, will be allowed a place among them. The segregation law will be abolished. When they face off in the game, Norfolk notices Archer's skill in bowling. Archer shocks everyone by revealing he is the son of Baron Baz, making him a nobleman. Norfolk is surprised that an Ethian could be of noble descent. Archer explains that his family sent him to France as soon as they discovered he was an Ethian, but he returned to England because it is his home and he doesn't want to live in hiding. When the game ends in a tie, Norfolk requests a final round to determine the winner. Archer easily wins, and Jane announces that they will gather in the Great Hall tomorrow to sign the agreement to end the segregation law. Afterward, a court member named Scrope proposes marriage to Jane. She tells him she's already married, but he says that her mother told him her husband isn't coming back. Jane is surprised by this. Meanwhile, in the forest, Guildford is with the Ethian when he suddenly attacks and ties him to a tree. Guildford is shocked and asks why he tied him up. The man reveals that he is not an Ethian, but a hunter who captures atheists. Guildford tries to trick him by asking for water, claiming to be thirsty. He manages to strike the hunter, take the key, free himself from the shackles. Unfortunately, the hunter attacks him, takes back the key, and throws it away. Guildford fights back and runs until he finds an old man. He asks the old man to free his neck from the iron because he will transform into a horse at dawn and die. The old man helps and frees him. Back at the palace, Dudley informs Jane that Scrope and Norfolk have taken their armies and left, and Mary is currently on her way to London with 10,000 soldiers. Jane goes to Archer to ask him and the atheist to join her in the fight, but he surprises her by refusing. Jane then sees Norfolk returning to the palace with Seymour. They order their soldiers to arrest Jane. She tries to escape the palace, but finds Mary and her soldiers in front of her, feeling trapped. Seymour takes the crown from Jane's head and gives it to Mary. Mary takes control and becomes the queen, sitting on the throne and ordering Jane's execution by beheading. Mary goes to her sister Bess's room to warn her not to make any mistakes again, threatening that she will cut off her head like Jane's if she does. Meanwhile, a maid named Kitty goes to Jane and tries to help her escape. At the same moment, Francis is with Mary, trying to convince her not to kill Jane because they are family and it's not right for family members to act this way. Mary remains adamant, informing her that she will appoint her daughter Margaret as her lady-in-waiting because Margaret told Seymour all of Jane's plans, without which Jane could have captured Mary. Francis is shocked and goes to confront Margaret. That night, Mary hosts a party with the entire royal court to announce her intention to execute Jane. Norfolk advises her to put Jane on trial, as the people might object to her execution without a fair trial. Mary agrees with his suggestion. She then announces to everyone that she plans to kill all the atheists in England. Petunia transforms into her human form and attacks Mary, attempting to kill her, but the guards stop her. Petunia then transforms back into a dog and escapes. Mary orders the guards to imprison Bess in her room, accusing her of treason. In a distant house in the forest, Dudley and Stan are hiding due to the current events. Suddenly, there is a knock on the door, and they discover it is Guildford. He talks to them about his plan to infiltrate the palace, but his father mocks him, telling him that there are 10,000 soldiers protecting Mary at the palace. This frustrates Guildford, as all he can think about is how to save Jane from execution. Guildford manages to reach Jane's room in the palace without being seen by the guards. Jane is overjoyed to see him, but tells him she won't escape with him. She urges him to flee because if anyone discovers his secret, they will kill him immediately. As they sit together, Jane tells Guildford that she knows what happened to his mother. Guildford confesses that he was responsible for her death, explaining that he was returning from court with his father as a child when a group of atheists attacked them. Terrified, he transformed into a horse for the first time. When his transformation ended, his mother was dead. He has been haunted by nightmares ever since, always dreaming that he killed her during his transformation. Jane tries to comfort him, telling him that he is the bravest person she has ever known, that he is risking his life now to save her. Suddenly, a guard enters the room, and Guildford jumps out of the window to escape. Edward is in the tavern with Fitz when he spots his guard, Charles, by chance. Charles recognizes King Edward and is shocked to see that he is still alive, contrary to what everyone believes. Edward learns that Charles is an Ethian and asks him for help to rescue Jane. The next morning, they reach the palace. Fitz leaves Edward, unwilling to risk his life for Jane, which disappoints Edward. Jane's trial is happening at that moment. Norfolk accuses her of being a traitor, stealing the throne from the rightful heir, Mary, and defying all the laws. laws. Jane stands up and defends herself, telling everyone that they saw Edward's will themselves, and he chose her to be the queen after him. She argues that it is the king's right to choose his successor, and that everyone must follow the king's orders without objection, which is what she did. Bess speaks up in support of Jane, testifying against Mary, and confirming that Edward had indeed decided to make Jane his heir, as she had seen and read the will herself. The attendees side with Jane against Mary, driving Mary into a furious breakdown. Norfolk orders the guards to take Jane to her room. When Jane reaches her room, she finds Edward waiting for her. She is shocked to see he is still alive and hugs him joyfully, but tells him he must leave because no one will believe he is alive, and Mary might kill him at any moment to protect herself. She advises him to plan carefully before confronting Mary. Jane returns to the trial to hear the judge's verdict. Norfolk announces that Jane is innocent, making her very happy. Her mother and sisters are overjoyed as well. Suddenly, Mary enters the courtroom with Seymour and brings in Robert, who has been beaten and tortured. Seymour forces Robert to reveal the truth about Guildford. He reluctantly confesses that Guildford is an Ethian. Everyone is shocked. Jane breaks down when she sees the guards holding Guildford in his horse form. Mary waits for sunset to prove Robert's claim. As the sun sets, Guildford returns to his human form, frightening and shocking everyone. Norfolk accuses Jane of breaking the segregation law by marrying Guildford, an Ethian, which carries the penalty of death. The guards then imprison Jane in the tower, leaving her sad and uncertain about her and her husband Guildford's fate. She notices that the spoon that comes with her food is sharp, so she tries to use it to dig into the cement around the window, hoping to loosen the iron bars and escape the tower. Just then, her mother enters and informs her that she made a deal with Mary to release and pardon Jane. She publicly declares that she was under the influence of love and accuses Guildford and all atheists of treason and being a danger. Jane is shocked by this request and accuses her mother of being heartless. Meanwhile, Mary blindfolds everyone who supported Jane against her, intending to make them run so she can shoot them with arrows. Norfolk is upset by her actions and tells her that she is acting like a tyrant, not a queen. Mary then decides to shoot Norfolk with an arrow. That night, Guildford wakes up to find himself imprisoned in a strange cell. He calls out for someone to answer him, but suddenly he hears the voice of the prisoner next to him, who introduces herself as Alice. She tells him to be quiet so no one comes because they are in the worst place in the world, the secret prison of Seymour's, where he tortures every Ethian for his own pleasure. Later, the guards take Jane to the stable, where she sees a dead and dismembered horse. She collapses in tears, thinking it is Guildford. Mary arrives and laughs, telling Jane it was a cruel prank, that Guildford is still alive. Jane is shocked by the malice in Mary's heart. Jane returns to the tower with a letter from Mary that she is supposed to memorize and recite to the people in exchange for being taken to Guildford and their freedom. However, the letter is filled with hatred against the atheists and Guildford, which goes against Jane's principles. She worries that if Guildford hears it, he will hate her, leaving Jane conflicted and unsure of what to do. Mary receives a gift from Philip, the Prince of Spain. Inside the box is the hand of the last Ethian in his country, as he managed to exterminate them all. Mary decides to marry Philip to unite their countries and together eradicate all atheists in the world. Seymour, upset and feeling betrayed, reminds her of their marriage agreement. Mary tells him that she will never marry him because she is a queen, and a queen marries a king or a prince. Mary brings Jane to another trial, intending for her to read the letter in front of everyone. However, Jane surprises her by refusing to read it, choosing to stick to her principles and her love for Guildford. Mary breaks down, infuriated, and orders the guards to take Jane back to the tower. Meanwhile, Dudley and Stan sneak into the palace disguised as workers. They knock out the guards, take their uniforms, and wear them to move around the palace unnoticed. Dudley goes to where Guildford is imprisoned and reassures him that he's there to rescue him. At the same time, Stan attacks Seymour, takes the keys to the secret prison, and frees Guildford. Guildford then frees Alice, who is initially too scared to escape. He gives her the key in case she changes her mind, and then escapes with his father and brother. Guildford tells them to split up to confuse Seymour and his guards. At that moment, Dudley confesses to Guildford that his mother's death was an accident caused during his transformation, and that he needs to forgive himself because his mother loved him. Guildford is deeply moved and starts crying. Suddenly, Seymour and his guards arrive. Guildford tells his father and brother to run and leave him. He then engages in a fierce fight with Seymour, but is ultimately overpowered and captured. Jane asks the guard George, standing at the door of the tower, to bring her a drink before her execution, as there are only a few hours left. George agrees. At the same time, Susanna is upset because she and the other atheists didn't help Jane. Archer tells her that he isn't willing to risk their lives to save Jane. Susanna reminds him that Jane has always been on their side and fought for them. That night, it is time for Jane and Guildford's execution. Jane sees Guildford tied tied to a post among the crowd. She deeply regrets all the lost moments between them, not having told him she loved him from the first sight. She places her head on the block as the executioner prepares to behead her. At that moment, a bird attacks the executioner, blinding him. A large flock of birds swoops down on the crowd, revealing they are atheists. Susanna transforms into her human form and saves Jane, telling her it was Edward's plan. Jane runs to Guildford to save him, but Guildford, fearing for her safety, tells her to leave him. Jane looks into his eyes with love, telling him she would never leave him, even if it means dying with him. She confesses her deep love for him. Guildford transforms into a horse, breaks free, and moves away from the fire. Jane climbs onto his back, and they escape together. Later, it is revealed that Mary is still the queen, and that Bess is an Ethian who transforms into a fox. Catherine marries Seymour's son after they fall in love. As for Jane and Guildford, they live happily together far away. However, Jane decides to return because she refuses to live in hiding. Guildford tells her that he will return and fight alongside her.